Hello, everyone. So we are picking up lesson 38, lecture 2, where we are continuing the story of Constantine's success and transformation of the Roman Empire. And one of the things we observed in the last lecture was that after the battle at the Milvian Bridge that allowed Constantine to rule the West, and after the battle at Adrianople, at which Licinius was able to win the East, and eventually with the two of them working out an East-West arrangement, in fact, the two also came to an agreement in what is known as the Edict of Milan that allowed Christianity to be a permitted religion. And this was very much at Constantine's urging and influence. And so, in fact, when in the year 324, at another battle at Adrianople, I know there were a lot of those, Constantine finally beat Licinius and was able to unite the whole empire. This was a real transformation in which now the Christians actually gained quite a bit of advantage. It wasn't just sort of balancing act. It was more that we had an emperor who, at least in a number of public pronouncements, self-identified as a Christian and promoted Christianity and Christian property holding and all that. So what this meant at the same time was a major transformation of Christianity as well as of the Roman Empire. And so in this section, I want to talk a little bit about how that worked out. And so I think one of the first things to distinguish is sort of population numbers, which are, by the way, incredibly hard to come by, sort of what percentage of the population was Christian at any given time. We will keep talking about this, but it's very clear that there remained a sizable population that was certainly not Christian at this time. And so the kind of numbers we get, you know, and this is, again, take it with a grain of salt, is that earlier maybe 10% of the population, but clearly after the 4th century, some people would say that maybe more than half of the population ended up converting. Maybe that would be something like towards the end of the 4th century. Christianity, of course, also went here on the left from an illegal religion to one favored and protected by the emperor. After Constantine, we have one emperor who is not Christian, who rules for 2 years. So that means essentially that starting with Constantine, practically all emperors are Christian and are protecting and supporting Christianity. From a persecuted minority, they are going to eventually become a persecuting majority. More on this in a moment. And relatively poor with little property, they're going to go into wealthy. And the very fact that they can have property and that they can receive gifts and donations, and this is something that will become very much a typical way for Christian communities to start to flourish, is that quite a few people left behind donations or part of their property when they were dying to a Christian community or to a particular Christian church, thereby enriching them. And so this is a process that really goes into full gear at this time. We also saw already with Perpetua how Christianity traditionally could be something that cut families apart. You remember Perpetua and her father had a very troubling relationship. Now, sort of social and family ties will not be necessarily disrupted by family members converting to Christianity. There has been, in fact, a lot of speculation about sort of how conversion and transformation into a Christian family might happen. Some people have proposed that in certain families, maybe the women started. I think it's very speculative, but we know a little bit more in the case of the upper classes. There is some trend there that the women convert first and then the men. But it's hard to know that exactly. But nevertheless, now, given that you don't have to die for your faith, this whole idea of disrupting your family will not be the case. And so also, there was quite a bit, you remember, in the concept of martyrdom that suggested a sort of value system that was very much focused on the other world, a reward in the afterlife, and also a strong sense that, you know, traditional sort of social values, such as property holding, may be in fact not that valuable from a Christian perspective. And that's definitely changing, right? As Christian churches can become wealthier and there is a new Christian leadership emerges in each cities under the guidance usually of a bishop. We see that a much more world-embracing value system evolve. And I think it's partially in reaction to this that we will see something develop, which is called monasticism, which is a sort of separate movement in which some people will choose nevertheless not to partake in their regular social life as Christians, but instead will choose to leave behind their traditional social and family ties and live sort of these monastic monk-like lives when they remove themselves from their family and live together with other monks and nuns, and that is going to emerge with the success of Christianity. In addition, spatially is also interesting how from before Constantine, a sense of non-belonging or homelessness, or even, I mean, it's very interesting, sort of the language that sometimes early Christians used was this sense that they are a nation, but a nation who does not belong to the nation who the Romans are, and not really being able to hold on to holy places. There is like very limited way to express, say, important locations in Jesus' life, you know, would not be honored, and they would be meeting in secret. In contrast, now the whole empire is in fact their home. The Holy Land recovered will be a big part of Constantine's benefactions. At some point, he will send his wife Helena to Jerusalem, and they will rebuild quite a bit of, or actually build up buildings that are related to Jesus's life and make them sort of sites of pilgrimage. So we clearly will see a change in sort of this concept of the Holy Land, which is, of course, will be applied to the area of the province of Judea. And then also, finally, the last bit here is you see here a public building, which was the Basilica, a public forum. We have seen this on the Forum of Trajan, will now become sort of a typical building structure for churches, often with, you know, usually those are just sort of a rectangle shaped buildings. And sometimes now they will put a sort of two X's on the side to make it the shape of a cross. So this will give us a sense of sort of how sort of, in fact, Christianity will also pick up on quite a bit of forms that come from sort of the non-Christian context. I think in some ways, these things that I've mentioned so far are very natural, and it's very easy for us to think like, oh, okay, I get it, you know, this is what happens when the Christians become powerful. But I think one of the things that's very almost surprising is that early on, or relatively early on, if we say that from 324, Constantine rules the whole of the Roman Empire, in the following year, so that is just 1 year later, there is a council, which is a meeting of all the heads of local churches, various bishops and other leaders. So they all come together in Nicaea, in the eastern part of the empire. And what they will be concerning themselves with, among others, in the discussions, is not just sort of practical matters and how to you know, run the church or various, you know, sort of practical issues in the transformations of power. But in fact, one of the things that will be very much on their mind is a group of Christians who are identified as Arians, and it's going to be what they actually believed. So very quickly, in fact, we will find the concept of heretic movements develop. So Constantine will not only you know, take benefit from, you know, being supported by Christian leaders, but he, in fact, will lead this council. We have beautiful descriptions of how, when he arrived, you know, everybody was just waiting for him, and he comes in last, everybody stands up. So there's a lot of respect given to him by these religious leaders. And instead, he not only, you know, says, oh, that's great, please support my power, but in fact, they will attack at this particular council meeting a group of Christians who are identified under this group, Arianism or Arians. And what is at issue might surprise you. So in the Holy Trinity, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, there is some discussion that that some of these followers of Arian would say is that the Father and the Son, that is God and Jesus, were not very similar. And, the argument very, very simply put is something like, Jesus had to come down on earth, so he had a body, therefore they have to have a different essence, right? God and Jesus, that is Father and Son. And what the Nicene Creed that was headed this meeting, the council at Nicaea decided, is that the Trinity cannot be divided and they are of the same essence, right? The Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Now, this seems like an absolutely nitpicky sort of minor question. However, this is exactly the kind of issue that divided Christians in this period. And there were a number of them sort of arguing around various issues. Another one that I like to discuss, because it's maybe in some sense it's easier to understand, is that during the persecutions in the early 4th century, so this is before Constantine came into power, some Christians in North Africa, when they were asked, are you a Christian? Everybody's knocking on their door. Some of them said, no, actually, I'm not a Christian, because they were thinking, well, I'm a Christian, but I don't want to die for this. And so there was a huge split among the churches in North Africa, but are the people who once said that they were Christians, but then when they were investigated, they said, no, I'm actually not a Christian, whether they should be allowed back into the church, whether those groups should be considered Christian, because, you can get it, next time they are asked, what are they going to say? So we see this is another group that then will be declared, heretic. And other groups, the Gnostics, which is a sort of more knowledge-based group. Montanism is led by a figure called Montanus in the 2nd century, who is a much more prophetic type of Christian leader. Then some people who get into discussions about, Mary, whether she was mother of Jesus or not, or about the nature of Christ. So these divisions very promptly popped up and divided the Christians amongst themselves, right? So these are not fights against pagans, or whom will be termed later on as pagans, but instead these will divide Christians among themselves. One way of thinking about it is maybe that it's a bit of a power struggle. And I think that you can just see how, in some sense, though, these kind of discussions will allow Constantine, depicted here very importantly with his halo, right? So he is a very important Christian figure on this depiction. And in fact, he will earn the name Constantine the Great, which the last time we checked was, Alexander the Great and Pompey the Great. So we will get, because of his transformation of the empire into Christianity, he will earn that great title. That Constantine will use these divisions to claim power to himself. And so to sort of top this, I think that he had to walk, though, very much a tightrope. And so in terms of whether he was fully a Christian and how to engage with traditional forms of power. And to sort of give you an example of this, it's worth looking at this beautiful arch in Rome called the Arch of Constantine. It's very close to the Colosseum when you go visit, which was built, voted on by the Roman Senate and offered to Constantine in 315. And what's interesting about this is that it, of course, looks like an incredibly elaborate triumphal arch, which could not be a more typical representation of Roman imperial power. But if we look at this image, we see that, in fact, what happened is that they took a bunch of stuff from, these are reliefs from that were created for a decorative object for Marcus Aurelius, these huge reliefs here. These roundels came from Hadrian's time. So we see that quite a few of these parts, this one is, these are Dacian captives from a monument of Trajan. So we see that quite a bit of this came from sort of earlier emperors. And what you should think about this is there is a nostalgia, maybe is the word I think Mary Beer uses describing it, or there is a sense that these forms of power, like he couldn't possibly be invested in doing such a big arch or having such a big arch developed, but instead in a bit of a haste, they use up these parts and create an arch for Constantine that evokes the past, but in its very colorful, different ages, groupings, it just calls attention to the fact that this was something that was done. And Constantine himself did create some buildings in Rome. There is San Giovanni. And there was even a story later on circulated, although we today think it was not historical, that at a certain point, Constantine gave the key to Rome to the Pope, thereby allowing, the city of Rome belong to the Pope, and Constantine himself sort of giving away that power, emphasizing sort of the religious authority over the city. We today don't think this was a historical move, but what it's partially based on is something quite surprising, which is that in the year 330, Constantine decided to develop a new city as the capital of his empire. This is a city that was known earlier as Byzantium, and it is right exactly in the Bosporus, where Europe and Asia meet, just below the Black Sea. And he very subtly called the new city Constantinople. And I think that what this had to do with is simply marking the fact that Constantine was creating a new empire. And for that new empire, Rome as a capital did not suffice anymore. This was a new empire. This was a Christian empire. You see the various churches. There is a forum, and there's in fact a capital. But I think it's very, very clear that this is a new kind of Roman empire under Constantine. Some of the wider societal, political, economic, and military transformations is what we are going to talk about in the next lecture.